thank you everyone for coming this morning. My name is Deborah Kafori. I'm the Multnomah County Chair and I use she, her pronouns. I want to thank you all for joining this call to officially release a report that examines the devastating impacts that an impending Cascadia subduction zone earthquake, or as most of us in the Pacific Northwest call it, the big one, would have on the critical energy infrastructure hub and ultimately our entire region. I'm joined by several other speakers this morning. We have Laura Marshall, who's the principal investigator for Echo Northwest, which prepared this report for Multnomah County and the city of Portland, as well as Portland City Commissioner Carmen Rubio, Oregon State Senator Michael Dembro, and Oregon State Representative Dacia Graber. I also want to recognize several other elected officials who have lent their support to the effort we have on the call this morning, and that's Commissioner Sharon Myron, Commissioner Jessica Vega-Peterson, and Commissioner Lori Stegman. Also, we have John Bashatinsky of the county's Office of Sustainability and Jana Papaefthemiou, Chief Resource for the City of Portland, and those folks will be able to answer any questions that you may have. As we've been reminded on numerous occasions over the last several years, Multnomah County holds a central role in preparing our community for and responding to natural disasters, whether that's raging wildfires, toxic air events, historic heat waves, or extreme cold. And sooner or later, it will be the region-altering Cascadia earthquake. We just marked the 322nd anniversary since the last big one, which means that the next earthquake isn't a matter of if, it's strictly a matter of when. And that's why the county, in partnership with the city, commissioned this study, because we absolutely must know the risks that the CEI hub, one of the most volatile and hazardous pieces of infrastructure in our entire region, poses to our residents and to our environment when the big one hits. Despite the inherent risks, the wetlands and creeks along the life-sustaining Willamette River were filled in to create industrial land downstream from the downtown core and literally across the street from my neighborhood. Today, more than 90% of all the fuel that's used in Oregon, oil, gas, diesel, and even jet fuel, passes through that land. And when the big one comes, the soil under that land will loosen, shake like Jello mold, and send the CEI into the river. And with it, a chemical catastrophe. The report we're presenting today gives us the clearest picture to date of what those risks look like, and just as importantly, how much is at stake if we let it come to pass. Essentially, the amount of oil spilled into the Willamette River and the areas surrounding the CEI hub after a Cascadia earthquake would rival that of the DP Deepwater Horizon. The spill would happen in a matter of minutes in the immediate wake of a disastrous earthquake in the heart of a major American city. The CEI hub, as it now stands, presents a single point of failure that promises immense consequences. Laura will share more of the report's key findings in just a moment, but that prediction alone should be enough to spur us to action. Which leads us to the other major lesson of this report. We simply cannot afford to do nothing about this threat sitting on our riverbank. From a dollars and cents standpoint, the report calculates damages in the billions if nothing is done to address the vulnerabilities of the CEI hub. And in doing nothing, we would also be needlessly risking the lives of so many of our loved ones, friends, and neighbors. We would be writing off the lands that Indigenous communities have made home since time immemorial. We would be perpetuating the follies of the past, except without the excuse of ignorance. Equipped with this information, inaction would be both practically foolish and ethically unacceptable. We can and we must act urgently and strategically to mitigate the risks laid out for us so clearly in this report. The public and private sectors will need to move forward together to help us steer clear of unimaginable harm and destruction. And I'm grateful for Senator Dembro and the others who are leading legislative efforts to move solutions forward, which you'll hear about shortly. Thank you again for being here today. And next, I will hand things off to Laura Marshall of Echo Northwest.
Thank you so much. And I have some slides to share, so let me just get those all set up. Perfect. And are you all seeing the note slide or the full screen? Just want to make sure I'm on the right.
Yep, we see your screen.
Really? Perfect. So good morning and thank you. My name is Laura Marshall. I'm an economist with Echo Northwest, and I was the project manager for this report, the impacts of fuel releases from the CEI hub due to Cascadia subduction zone earthquake. For those of you who aren't familiar, this picture here shows some of the tanks that we're talking about. You can drive on Northwest St. Helens Road, though, just immediately northwest of downtown Portland, and see this there. Before we get started, I do want to thank the City of Portland and Multnomah County for their sponsorship of this work, and also thank the subconsultants that we had. Hart Krauser did the geotechnical analysis for this, and Enduring Econometrics and Adam Demansky, who's here today as well, will help answer any questions. The legal financial liability piece of it and some of the damages and costs. So big thanks to both of them. So what was our study? This study extended out of prior work that's been ongoing for at least the last decade. One of the most notable is a 2012 report by the Oregon Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, Dogami, who evaluated the earthquake risk there at the CEI hub. That was followed up by a Dusica and Norton study in 2019, so not too long ago, estimating the quantity and characteristics of the tanks in the supporting soil. So we build upon that and do something similar to Dusica and Norton, but with additional information and more detail to estimate the magnitude and extent of essentially what will be released. So what fuels are there? Where are they likely to go? What's the seismic integrity of the tanks and containing structures? Are they going to go in the ground, the air, the water, etc.? Where I think we really add value is the next two things that we did, which had not been done before for this CEI hub area, which is evaluating the resulting damages and costs, which I think you got a preview of, and as well as the identifying financial responsibility. So if there are releases, not only how bad is it going to be, but who's going to pay for this? Today, I'm going to focus on the resulting damages and costs, because hopefully with prevention, the financial responsibility piece can actually be avoided. So what were our findings? Broadly, with the data that we have available, which I'll speak more about that, but with the available data and the understanding of soil liquefaction and lateral spread is what it's called, but essentially just how much is the earth going to move, how stable are these soils? They're not very stable because a lot of it was built upon the dredge material from the river, which is sandy and silty. And the tanks that we have, the total estimated releases are in the range of 95 million to 194 million. And yes, that is a big range. And that gets to some of the data questions that we have that I'll go into in the next couple slides. For context, and this was alluded to earlier, Deepwater Horizon, the largest oil spill in US history, was in the same range up to about 200 million gallons at the top end of the estimates for that. So this is really a picture that I think we can paint of one of the largest oil spills, if not the largest oil spill in US history, that could potentially occur immediately downstream from the urbanized core of City of Portland in an industrialized area with residential properties next door, with the city resource of Forest Park, the natural resources of the river in addition to the park, in an extremely environmentally sensitive habitat and really economically dense part of a metropolitan area. So this would be a highly disruptive event. And all of that happening in the aftermath of the big one, when emergency response efforts would be needed to both respond to this event as well as all the other things that would be ongoing in this time. So our task to estimate the damages and costs was challenging because there's not a prior event that we can point to and say, oh, this is just like this other event that occurred. We do a review of all their oil spill events and earthquake events, but they provide limited insights in part because of the stark difference in conditions. And so that gets us to our monetized estimate of the damages and costs. Now, what's really important to point out here is that we're talking here only about the costs that we felt comfortable with and were able to monetize. Because of some of the uncertainty, we did not monetize everything. And so for this reason, this range of 359 million to 2.6 billion can be thought of as a minimum. And I'll go into the specific costs on the next slide. But what we do know based on this context and this picture I just tried to paint for you of what's going to be going on, the total cost and damages would likely be many multiples times that monetized amount based on what we've seen in other locations. So high level of the findings, I'm not going to go into all of them, but just to show you some of the big ones, the highest cleanup costs are, or the highest costs are for cleanup being the biggest one. And this is to be expected because this would be an event that would require an immediate response, resource intensive response. Cleanup obviously could be hampered by earthquake conditions as well, something that we did not monetize through any of this. All of these costs are for the oil spill itself. We really tried to isolate that in our methods. Next impacts the habitats and species. So we've all seen the oiled bird picture. That's kind of what we're talking about here. What would be needed to pay for mitigation, recognizing that mitigation doesn't get you back the species that were lost in the event. Human health for both air quality, fire being the big question mark here on air quality and from potential for fire, as well as the vapors and fuel releases. In addition, other large oil spill events show us that explosions are very likely. There's injury and death often associated with any time you have an explosion like this, especially if it occurs at a time when there are a lot of people on site, so a weekday. Impacts to fuel prices. 90% of Oregon's liquid fuel supply, including the gasoline and diesel that we all use in our cars, comes through the CEI hub. And so this, again, not including earthquake effects, but just the impact to supply chain, about 120 million. And that's a big question mark there with the earthquake on how long that would last and the severity of that in conjunction with the roads maybe being out of service and the change in demand that would happen then. So those are monetized costs up to high range. There's a lot of unknown costs with impairing earthquake and recovery efforts if emergency resources are strained because they're responding to this, or maybe this oil spill event is able to travel further, potentially down the water because it's not contained as quickly because of earthquake activities impairing the timeline for when it could be responded to. So a lot of uncertainties that we don't monetize there. Things like commercial and recreational fisheries would really depend on the impacts to those commercial and recreational species, particularly salmon, which would vary by time of year. And other things like if the commercial industries could substitute to other fishery species for the time being, so we don't monetize those. And fire damage, as I alluded to as well, there's residential properties very near this and forest park. So other than this being about the CEI hub, what is the link with SB 1567? Well, the first thing we had to do for this work was identify the tanks and their risk. And that was not an easy task because there's no centralized information source for the seismic integrity of the tanks or their containment mechanism or any of the happenings at the CEI hub properties. So that was the first challenge and something that SB 1567 would obviously help with. Also a lack of information about the tanks themselves and what's stored in there. From the work by Jessica and Norton, City of Portland, and the State Fire Marshal, our compilation of the tanks and aerial folders, we were looking at the tanks, trying to literally line them up with data that we had. 193 out of the 630 that we were able to identify have unknown age, and age is kind of the proxy for seismic resiliency. We know these tanks are pretty old. The average tank age for the data that we do have is 1954, which is well before any of the seismic standards that we have today. So the nexus with SB 1567, the spill alone won't prevent this event from happening, but it's the necessary next step to ensure we fully understand the risk. And I will stop there and pass it on to whoever is next. Apologies, I don't have the run of show right in front of me.
Thank you so much, Laura. I think that's Commissioner Rubio.
Commissioner Rubio. Yep, Carmen Rubio. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. I'm Portland City Commissioner Carmen Rubio, and I use she, her pronouns. And I'm joined by Jana Papa Eftimu, and the city's Chief Resilience Officer, who is also available on behalf of the city to answer questions today. The information in this report should both get our attention about all that is at risk and also underscore the urgent need for action at the state and local level. At the city, we've made and will continue to make significant investments so that Portland is more resilient in the face of disasters. But with the future Cascadia earthquake, we will either be ready or we won't. And Portland's readiness will impact far more than just our city. If we are not ready, explosions and spilled fuel from the CEI hub could also ignite fires near our treasured forest park. It could severely clog our Willamette River, and it could also severely harm other communities that are downriver from these events. Such a spill disaster will limit our ability to get critical life-saving supplies where they need to go. Again, not just to Portland, but to our entire region. Familiarizing ourselves, preparation and planning, all critical elements of this bill are crucial steps to put our region on the path to resilience. And being resilient means that after a major Cascadia subduction zone event or any event, we have fuel and resources to run emergency vehicles, to distribute drinking water, to restore a working communications infrastructure, and the ability to take care of impacted communities regardless of their location. So while the CEI hub may be located in Portland, its potential failure should concern all Oregonians. And as Oregonians, we pride ourselves on our love for the environment and appreciation for nature and our rivers. These are things that are a part of our shared identity as Oregonians. And for our Native communities and Oregon's First People, rivers have been a source of food and connection to community culture and identity since the beginning of time. And over the years, many advocates, government, and communities have worked hard and spent a great deal of resources to restore the Willamette so that future generations can have that same relationship. But we risk losing all of this if we do nothing. The failure of the CEI hub will also have disproportionate impacts on Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other people of color communities by forcing them once again to bear the brunt of these things through pollution, water contamination, and chemical exposure. And that's why we're here today. As local and state level leaders, we know that we must work together, regardless of geography and political affiliation, to mitigate seismic risks. The City of Portland is proud to partner with the county and with Senator Dembro to introduce SB 1567 this session. And we thank the bill's many co-sponsors for supporting reasonable, measured action to address the seismic vulnerability of our aging fuel infrastructure this session. I'll now turn it over to Senator Dembro to describe his efforts to address these risks.
Thank you, Carmen. Pleasure to have you here with us. Friends, as Chair Kafori mentioned, the week before last, we celebrated, if we can use that word, the 322nd anniversary of the most recent huge subduction zone earthquake on the West Coast, which occurred during the night of January 26, 1700. The average recurrence of subduction zone earthquakes of this magnitude in this part of the Pacific is every 234 years. So we're already 100 years overdue, in a sense, living on borrowed time. Or put another way, we're living with a ticking time bomb. We know more and more what the catastrophic effects of an earthquake of this magnitude will be. Thanks to the report that we've received today, we know even more about the potential effects on the hub of fuel tanks that line the Willamette in Portland. But really, this is just another in a series of studies and reports, a dozen at least in recent years, that have helped us to understand the problem and our lack of preparation. They all point to the same conclusion. Government needs to step up to make sure that these fuel tanks are in a position to withstand the worst effects of the shaking and liquefaction, to protect life and the environment. And right now, the necessary oversight is fragmented or outright lacking. Senate Bill 1567 will provide that oversight. DEQ will be directed to create a program to regulate the tanks, requiring vulnerability assessments of each of the large tanks in the hub, along with a very large facility in Eugene, to be performed by the summer of 2024. It also requires each of the facilities to submit hazard reduction plans for DEQ approval that same summer. They will then need to begin to comply with those plans. At the same time, the bill directs the Oregon Department of Energy to develop a statewide energy security plan to plan for disruptions of the state's energy supply. If a decision is made to relocate tanks, the department is required to make sure that they're not located in the backyards of low-income communities of color, as they so often have in the past. Also, they'll need to make sure that those plans align with our state's fossil fuel reduction goals. Senate Bill 1567 is the first step in a multi-year plan to deal with this risk. The EQ will submit policy recommendations to the legislature by November 2024, based on the findings from the hub, so that the legislature can continue this vital work in the 2025 session. Senate Bill 1567 will have a public hearing today at 3:15 in the Senate Energy and Environment Committee. You know, every time I drive by the hub or see it from a distance, I have a nightmare vision that the earthquake strikes, as we know it will, and we elected officials are left having to ask ourselves, why did we ignore the warnings? Why did we turn a blind eye to the science and keep putting them out of mind? Why did we not step up and insist upon action? If that occurs, how do we live with ourselves? Fortunately, I believe that the time is right for people to step up. Senate Bill 1567 has already developed broad support, ranging from local governments to environmental groups, to environmental justice groups, to tribes, to experts in geology, engineering, and emergency management, who all know the problem and know that Oregonians are ready for a solution. In closing, I want to express my gratitude for the support of my 18 colleagues who are regular sponsors for Senate Bill 1567, and particularly the 6 co-chief sponsors who've joined me in chief sponsoring this bill. They are Senator Lou Frederick of Senate District 22, which includes North Portland communities on the Willamette River. Senate Committee on Veterans and Emergency Preparedness Chair, Senator James Manning of Eugene. Representative Paul Evans of House District 20, who until recently chaired the House Committee on Veterans and Emergency Management. Representative and Dr. Maxine Dexter of House District 33, which includes the CEI hub. Representative Con Pham of House District 46, who serves on the House Committee on Environment and Natural Resources and has provided tremendous leadership this session in the Environmental Caucus. And finally, Representative Dacia Graber of House District 45, the new chair of House Emergency Preparedness, to whom I will now turn the spotlight to explain why she is among our chief sponsors of this bill. Dacia.
Thank you so much, Senator Dembro. Good morning. My name is Dacia Graber, and I'm honored to be here today as the State Representative, House District 35, current metro area firefighter, chair of House Veterans and Emergency Management, and one of the many authors of the 2019 OSPAC report that made a clarion call on this issue. For those not familiar with OSPAC, that's the Oregon State Policy Advisory Commission, an appointed group of scientists, stakeholders, and emergency managers working together to address seismic threats and resilience. To say I have waited for years for this moment is an understatement. I first became aware of the catastrophic potential of the CEI hub as an emergency management exercise designer with the 2016 Cascadia Rising exercise, a full-scale regional FEMA exercise that examined how a 9.0 subduction zone earthquake would affect our state. During the course of that design, I remembered my frank horror at what I learned. Tank failure at the hub would be currently an unmitigated disaster. As a first responder, every time I pass by the hub, I'm reminded of a looming catastrophe that would result in devastating loss of life, from the hub workers to the first responders to the surrounding frontline communities, and the rippling devastation that would unfold in the months and years and even decades to come. To be clear, what would start as potential rupture or collapse and fuel spillage would almost certainly rapidly ignite into a toxic fireball and flame front that would eviscerate anything and everyone in its path. What survived the fuel-pushed fire would then be blanketed in heavy carcinogen-laden smoke that would coat anything downwind. Not only the fuel itself, but the chemicals of combustion would seep into our waters and soils and create contamination that would take decades to address. And as you have heard, this is not just a Portland issue. Your fire engines and ambulances in Bend, in Pendleton, and LeGrand, the fuel they rely on to operate comes from this hub. The emergency generators that would be powering most of the state west of the Cascades in a megaquake, they too rely on this hub for their fuel. If I sound dramatic about this, well, I keenly feel the urgency. Your state's emergency managers, seismic professionals, hazmat specialists, firefighters, and environmental advocates have been sounding the alarm for years because we know we're living on borrowed time before the next large earthquake. The time to act on this is long past, and we owe it to our frontline communities and responders and generations of Oregonians to come to stand up and demand better. I'm proud to be a chief sponsor of Senate Bill 1567 and push for this first step at accountability and community safety. The time is now. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. I'm going to ask now all of our speakers to come back on the screen, please. Everybody who's here, including John and Jonna, and we're going to open it up for questions. Reporters, if you could please put your name in the chat or unmute yourself. Let's put your name in the chat so we can call on you in order. And then you can go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question. Or if you're having mic problems, we can go ahead and translate. So please go ahead. Monica Samoya from OPB.
Hi, I'm Monica Samayoa. Can you guys hear me? Or can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so I was wondering if there's I guess a little bit more clarification or explanation on kind of just the range of damage for the neighborhoods that are nearby or the riverfront properties.
Sure, I can jump in there. This is Laura. So a lot of that I think will depend on fire. We have every reason to believe that a fire is likely because there are multiple ignition sources like down power lines, and these fuels are largely flammable. Again, this is where it gets sticky in terms of emergency response efforts. The firefighters will be extremely strained during this time. So there are concerns about their ability to respond quickly if in the likely event that a fire does occur. But as we've seen with wildfire, the spread's just so hard to predict, depends on winds, depends on weather conditions, that sort of thing. I will say in terms of health effects though, the areas immediately nearby the CEI hub, so we're talking half a mile, anywhere close, and this is a 6-mile stretch of the river, of course, where the properties are, and so this is not uniformly distributed across. But the people who are closest, what we saw in Deepwater Horizon was a lot of the response workers were the ones who actually had health costs that they could prove after the event. And so similar to this, response workers as well as the people living immediately nearby. Our report does detail for oiling of shorelines. So there's about 1,000 waterfront properties downstream. And so we do have a lot of detail in the report about the potential for oiling of shorelines and temporary impacts on property values based on the literature.
And just a quick follow-up, I guess, so for like the a range of explosions that would happen there, would they reach neighborhoods?
The explosions themselves generally are fairly condensed because the fuels are all in one spot. It would really depend tank by tank though, material by material. I would say the explosion risk isn't one that we monetize in the report, nor fire risk, but those are both things that I would say fire risk would be much more likely than explosion.
Thank you.
And of course, people also work there too, so that's another.
Yeah.
And if I may briefly follow up as the firefighter here,
Please do. Yes.
the tank, the spill, depending on the magnitude of the spill and how it spreads, it won't all necessarily sink. So if there's floating fuels and those are ignited, depending on wind direction, depending on amount, you could very well see this encroaching into neighborhoods across the river. So that's some of the modeling we've looked at from a hazmat perspective. So really, there's so many unknown factors to this, the amount of fuel, the wind, but it is a possibility.
Thanks, Monica. Tracy Lowe from the Statesman Journal.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So are the private owners of the tanks expressing any similar alarm, and have you had any conversations with them to see what they would be willing to do or what kind of state help could motivate them?
I can jump in on that. Yeah, we've been in a lot of conversation with the owner operators, and they recognize the risk. And I would say that they want to be part of the solution. I don't believe that they're opposing this bill. We are hoping so let me say that the funding of this will be shared. The state will, our general fund will pay for the program at DEQ. There'll be some engineering analyses of the risk assessments and mitigation plans. And those the owners will pay for that, and of course they'll have the expense of doing any of the mitigation that's called for, as well as the assessments. We are hoping, and we think that we're in a good moment for this, that we can get some federal infrastructure dollars to help with this. The bill creates a fund that can be filled with transfers from federal resources to help us do this. This is, we don't know what we're going to see, but we suspect that there's going to need to be, some retrofitting, potentially even some relocation. And that will be something that will be addressed sort of in the next phase of the legislation. If there are relocation decisions, what that would look like, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you, Senator. Next, we're going to hear from Barbara Bernstein at KBOO.
I'm wondering how this is an opportunity for Oregon to look seriously at what our climate goals are, and that maybe we should be looking at dismantling a lot of the CEI hub and not storing the types of flammable and very hazardous, toxic, and also climate changing materials that are in there. And is that part of the plan at all?
It is, Barbara. It's part of the planning that the Department of Energy will be doing as part of what they call their energy security plan. That's going to be a factor. Looking at, we don't want to see tanks relocated and replaced by new tanks, which are just going to become stranded assets down the road, because we need to steadily reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. So those are going to go hand in hand. It'll improve safety, and at the same time, we'll reduce our dependence on fossil fuels. That's the goal.
And I have a follow-up, because this has been gnawing at me ever since I started listening to this presentation. Is there any plan in place to deal with this before the plan actually becomes law? I mean, what happens if the earthquake happens any day now?
I think the report details that in some to some degree, and of course other reports have also done that as well. If it happens today, we're in big trouble, given the age of the tanks, the soil conditions at the hub, and all the other characteristics. I've heard it described as kind of like the worst place you could have possibly put this kind of infrastructure, and that's why this effort is so important. I would also say too, to your other question, the county and the city's goal is to get to 100% renewable energy by the year 2050. So I agree with your premise that ultimately the lands of the CI hub need to be put to better use, and hopefully would lead to more employment, in that area of the city that's well situated, I think, to lead on a renewable economy.
Thank
I'll
you.
just add to that. There is a oil spill response plan for the Lower Columbia River that I'll put in the chat now.
Thanks, Laura. Next, we're going to hear from Joe Ranieri from KGW.
Hey guys, hey, quick question. With some of the pictures you have on the on that you've made available, who should I courtesy if I want to use that for my story of the hub?
It's Matoya Nakamura from Multnomah County. Joe, I'll send you, I'll put it in the chat.
Perfect. And that's not my actual question, but that was one of I had. The other question I had is obviously the terminal owners have to submit a plan, an assessment plan. Have you talked with any of them about what their plan might be to mitigate any issues down the road, when ultimately we do have the big earthquake?
We haven't gotten into that level of specifics. I think, they're taking it one step at a time. The risk assessments will be done, they'll be submitted, they'll be evaluated, and so forth. I will say that many of the companies, particularly the larger ones, are already doing their risk assessments. They know what the risk is. And I would say that broadly speaking, they understand that there is significant risk. And
not on the journey.
Yeah. Okay, Paul, I think you need to go on mute.
If there's anybody else going to follow up on that?
I would just say too that the local and state regulation is required here because there's gaps in some of the federal regulation as well. I know that
Right.
The senator intends to dive into that today. But just a quick example of that is the containment berms at those facilities are designed to hold the contents of the largest tank if the largest tank there were to rupture. But of course, during a large seismic event, the multiple tanks would rupture. So and the berms themselves would likely fail. So there's the way we've structured the regulatory landscape so far is inadequate.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And once all of these risk assessments come in the summer of 24, DEQ will be in a position finally to really be able to look at the hub comprehensively, because right now the companies are tending to look at their individual facilities and the potential risks that they face. But we really need to look at what will be the interrelationship between all of these facilities, that there are so many located in such close proximity. That really changes the picture. And so I think that will really add to this. As John mentioned, during the hearing this afternoon, we will be hearing from someone from the EPA who will talk about the federal regulation, which, there are pieces of federal regulation, but they don't address earthquakes. And that's just one example of how fragmented the regulation is here in this space.
Thank you, Senator. We're going to hear from Annette Newell from KXL, please.
Hi there. I wanted to direct this actually at Representative Graber and Senator Dembro. Can you kind of take us through next steps in this legislation, and how long would it be before we would see some concrete action, do you think?
I'll defer to the senator on this.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of the process, we'll have a hearing this afternoon. I expect that we'll have a hearing, a work session that is a vote on it. either on Wednesday or next Monday. We do have an amendment that's being drafted today that does some clarifications, and it will be ready apparently by the end of today. So it should be ready for us to vote on Wednesday. This will require some state allocation for DEQ to stand up the program. So it will need to go through our Ways and Means process. So I would say that the vote on the bill, it's getting to the floor, probably won't be for another couple of weeks. But then, DEQ will start the program immediately. They'll go through a rulemaking process, for, working with the Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, some engineering firms, to come up with what needs to be in these risk assessments, what needs to be in the hazard mitigation plans. And, I expect that some of the companies will start right away. And, once they've identified weaknesses, they'll actually start to work on them. But when they turn in their plans, they'll then, go into some back and forth with DEQ about, potential changes and so on. But, we should start seeing the work, in a best case scenario right away, but at least by the summer of 2024, it should begin.
Okay. And in terms of what can actually mitigate the situation and the cost of it, you kind of have outlined the cost of not acting and how catastrophic that would be. But what would the dollar cost on these mitigation efforts be?
I'll tell you, it'll be a tiny fraction of what you heard about today. That's one thing that's clear. I probably defer, Laura, I don't know if you have a better sense of that, or certainly Jonna, you probably do, of what some of the state steps that could be taken, that will need to be taken to address the risk.
Maybe I'll start and then pass it to Laura. I wouldn't want to attribute a dollar amount to the work at this time, because we really don't know. That's why we need the study. But the kinds of actions that can be taken, in addition to strengthening the containment berms around the tanks, would be things like strapping the tanks to the ground. Not all of them are even firmly connected to a foundation because they're so old. Creating flexible connections between the tanks and the pipes that serve them, so if they move around, that the pipes doesn't break off. But then the greatest risk is really from liquefaction of soil, that kind of quicksand effect that happens in an earthquake. And it's actually possible to retrofit soils to strengthen them through drilling and things like injecting cement or other things into the soil under the tank to prevent liquefaction. And so that can be the argument in the past has been that that's expensive to do, and I think it is, but this study I think shows that inaction is also quite costly. And so so we're hopeful that in 2024, when we have the results back, that we'll see that this is possible to be accomplished.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one or two more. We have Isabel Garcia from the Portland Mercury.
Hi, thank you. I am just wondering, my understanding when it comes to federal policy on who is liable for the spill, there's an acts of God clause that deals with natural disasters. I'm just wondering how, any clarity that we have around these reports clearly spelling out the threat that the CEI hub has after an earthquake. How does that play into that acts of God clause?
That's a great question, and I'll start it off. My colleague Adam Demansky is also on the line. So Adam, if you'd like to pop in, feel free to go on video and I can pass it off to you. So yes, Act of God is under the Oil Pollution Act as a something that would make it so that the companies would potentially not be liable. We will say though that because there is a trust fund established, the cost would still be paid for. There's still a mechanism for that. And there is some precedence for Act of God with Hurricane Ida, that being a hurricane, not an earthquake, but that was not defined as an act of God. So it's something that would likely be litigated. Adam, do you want to jump in there too?
Yeah, no, Laura, that's spot on. And I think the Gulf of Mexico is a kind of prime example. I think we're fortunate that these earthquakes don't happen more frequently. I'm sure the ultimate liability will definitely be litigated should it occur. But in the Gulf of Mexico, there's a lot of oil infrastructure. Hurricanes don't happen all the time, but they do happen periodically enough that they do not generally count as the act of God, that is part of doing business in that part of the world, and oil companies prepare for that. And so I think with this report, we would hope and the expectation that the CSZ event and earthquakes in the Pacific Northwest are part of doing business in this part of the world. And I would see that there's a lot of logic to argue that it would not be an act of God.
Thanks, Adam. Adam, maybe you could put your spelling of your name and title in the chat so reporters have that, because we hadn't introduced you. Thanks for joining us. We have a final question from Tracy Lowe at the Statesman Journal. Tracy, go ahead.
Thank you. Do you know whether there are similar hazardous tank farms in Washington and California, and how do our oversight and regulations compare to those in other West Coast states?
Others may be able to answer this better than I, but my understanding is that the neighboring states do have better, more coordinated regulation. But their tanks and the refineries that are in those areas are built on much more solid ground than ours. I mean, that's something that I heard from industry. We are unfortunately unique in just how bad a location the CEI hub is in terms of being right next to the river in a city on soil that will liquefy, that's river fill, and just it all adds up in just a horrendous way. Laura, do you have experience with this?
I will say that there are, can you hear me okay? Apologies, my internet cut out. Okay, perfect. I will say that we looked to the city of Vancouver, and there was a study done for the Tesoro proposed facility there that has some good insights in terms of the Washington side of things. But yes, overall, this is something that occurs up and down the West Coast. The pipeline, actually, if you look in the report for in chapter 1, I believe we have a map of the pipelines, which is also an important thing to remember, that that's going from basically Bellingham, Washington, out to Portland and the Portland airport, and down south a little bit as well. And so that's another regional approach that could be used to look at this issue.
All right. We want to thank everyone, our speakers, giving us so much time this morning. Really appreciate it. If any reporters or producers have any follow-up questions, you can contact myself or Stephen or Sierra. Our contact information is at the press release that you should have on your desk. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. And until 3:15, we will, many of these people will be back here, back online, not here, but online, to be talking about this with the Senate subcommittee. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great week and stay safe.